Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Ayla Bombe wash processed Ethiopia from Bold Bean Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Bold Bean, based out of Jacksonville, Florida. And once again, they were a suggestion to us by Patrick Irvin and Zach Burnett. So once again, a shout out to and thank you to Patrick and Zach for the suggestion. This is Bold Bean's third full review on this channel, having previously reviewed the Yirgacheffe, a natural processed Ethiopian coffee. And of the coffees that we've discussed from Bold Bean up to this point, this is the one that is most in line with my own preferences. So it'll be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 43. And recipe we went with for this coffee was once again our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I also like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. This one, I feel like, relative to the other coffees that we did have from this coffee roaster, was perhaps a slight bit lighter than the other ones, as it didn't have quite as much of those developed qualities to it. Even then, I feel like most people still probably align this one with being on either that more developed side of that light medium or on the lighter side of a medium, as it certainly still had a little bit of those qualities. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression through the V60, and while it's not necessarily the lightest coffee out there, it does present itself in a pretty well-defined sense with a prominent citric quality to go with a honeysuckle and peach-like feel. Sweet and intense for a washed Ethiopian coffee, so it did start off pretty nice, as that intensity for Ethiopian coffees, especially washed Ethiopian coffees, oftentimes can be very nice, even if it does come at the cost of maybe having a little bit more robustness and heaviness to it in general. Day 18 through the Chemex, and there were some pretty similar results to the first day, as it's a bit better this time around, which has been consistent with our experiences on this coffee roaster, as there's a bit more intensity with the coffee skewing a bit more on the honeysuckle side of things, with a nice complementary peach aspect to it. It does cool down into a much more citric forward feel, with this one being solid yet again. So of the three coffees that we had from them, this one, as of these first two experiences, was certainly the best by a pretty distinct difference for me and my preferences. Day 21 is through the April Brewer, and it has backtracked a little bit, and for whatever reason, I really struggled with the April Brewer on all of these coffees, as it didn't necessarily seem like toning these coffees down or going lower on the extraction of these coffees seemed to help, as at the forefront it's pretty well defined, but slightly uneven in terms of the citric qualities, with a bit more of the peachiness on the back end. The roastiness this time around was presented a little bit more, as it did mar the overall cleaner qualities of this coffee, muddling the florality itself, giving it a much more robust feel. And that was probably the biggest issue that I did have anytime I wanted to kind of tone these coffees down, is I was feeling a little bit more of those qualities. But I'll go back to the fact that I really don't think that my water is meant for a coffee like this. Day 24 through the V60 with Bold Bean's recipe, which once again lower temperatures and higher concentration, and there were mixed results, as the coffee is toned down altogether with a lingering brightness that's in line with a lot of the listed fruit profiles of it, but also there is a earlier peachiness that is toned down as a result. So I wasn't necessarily enjoying that aspect. Anytime you're going to tone down the peachy qualities of a coffee, the stone fruit qualities of a coffee, that's going to be a negative point for me, as that's one of the more enjoyable experiences, especially when it comes for a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. We move on to day 27, as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it was yielding similar results, as it's slightly reminiscent of the Nansebo Mewa from John Small, offering a very well-defined lime-like aspect to go with the peachiness. And if there's a coffee that this one reminded me of the most, it was probably that coffee, especially given that they both seemed to accentuate and focus on the lime-like aspects of those coffees. Slightly herbal and candied with a lingering roastiness to the cup as well, so that continued to kind of mar the overall experience within this one. Day 30 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it's performing a bit better with these adjustments, and that has been also very consistent with the experiences I had with this coffee roaster. Every time we went back to the V60 with our standard recipe after a couple of days on experimenting with this coffee, it just really seemed to improve, as it has helped with the intensity. It is much more stone fruit forward, which is the most important aspect for this coffee with me. Otherwise, still pretty direct with a bit of robustness and citric forward tones, but just notably better overall. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and once again, I decided I wanted to stick with the V60. The Chemex, our water, and the April brewer really didn't seem to work well with the coffees that we had from Bold Bean, as the final brew of this method seems to just intensify the much more robust qualities of this coffee, which is also still consistent. So these coffees, with the experiences we had, were all very consistent. I feel like it was very easy to work with these coffees because I knew what to expect every single time we tinkered with them or made any sort of adjustments based off the experiences we had with each of them. Plenty of lingering citric qualities being the primary focus of this one. So on day 36, we went back to the V60 with our standard recipe. And I do have to say the coffee for the most part has been pretty consistent with the overall theme that it presents, as there's plenty of the listed citrus, stone fruit qualities, floral qualities, lime attribute being the most dominant, followed by the florality, relatively high level of body and plenty of intensity with a lingering citric finish to it as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And a lot of level 4s in this one, so let's go through them. And we will start with the cleanliness level 4. I feel like in the same vein that we discussed the Julian Calderon having a little bit of that roasty quality that may have had the potential to hinder the overall clarity to it. The rest of this coffee was well defined enough, especially within the citric aspects, that I could justify the level 4 mark, though maybe that's a little bit of a stretch for some people. I still think it was clean enough, as the other qualities of it, that's the only thing that could really kind of take away from this coffee. Finish, level 4, and this one definitely had the least amount of that lingering sort of roasty feel to it in the finish. If anything, it's had a little bit more of a floral-like aspect to it. I think jasmine, or maybe just a generic floral, is one of the notes that they do have listed on here. A bit more honeysuckle-like for me most of the time, but even then that was the more prominent finish as opposed to that slightly more smoky quality to it. Sweetness level 4, and that's probably one of the more enjoyable parts about this coffee. If there's a silver lining I've taken away from this coffee roaster in general, it's that their coffees aren't lacking any sort of sweetness, as this one had plenty of intensity and a very sweet, we'll even say lime-like, as well as fruit quality in general. So pretty high in that sense. Florality, level 4. I mentioned that a lot of the florality that I was experiencing from this coffee was a bit more on the honeysuckle side of things, though I do have to say that by the end, it was definitely the secondary aspect to what we'll discuss next, the citrus fruit being there at the level 4. Easily the most prominent quality within this coffee, a lot of lime-like aspects to it. I continue to highlight the reality, or the fact that it reminds me a lot of the Nansebo Mewa, both of which just very lime forward, and that was by far the most distinct characteristic within this coffee. Stone fruit, level 4. I recall they had, maybe it's jasmine, or it's like peach soda or jasmine candy or something along the lines. I'm getting the notes of these Bold Bean coffees mixed up, but I do recall that they had something along those lines listed on here. The peachiness, though, to this one was, I want to say, prominent enough, even though it was the tertiary characteristic, to justify that level 4 mark. And it was presented clean and direct enough at times to still justify that level 4 mark, even if it wasn't necessarily the most abundant quality within this coffee. Couple of level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. That's been very consistent. Every single coffee that we had reviewed from them did score that level 3, so they're not intended to necessarily be the brightest coffees out there. And going into it, this one is probably the one that I expected to be maybe the least bright of those 3, so not surprising whatsoever. Final thing worth discussing, body level 3, and that's going to be the weirdest one for me because the other 2 coffees we discussed from them both scored a level 2, and I think in theory, both of them I would have expected to score higher than that. They were all brewed with the same brew method, and this one being a washed Ethiopian coffee, in theory should be the least textured of the 3, but it's the one that scored the highest. And once again, making these tasting wheels side by side, one after another, I found it very interesting that it did just feel a little bit more textured on that final day. So outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Not surprising that this one was easily my favorite of the 3 coffees that we did have from Bold Bean, as it's the one that's most in line with my own preferences. But at that same token, I've said so many times in the past that washed Ethiopian coffees are probably my least favorite coffees to review, because at least when it comes to a coffee that I don't necessarily like natural processed Colombian coffees, I can find something different, or I can look for something different, or hope that they might turn out better than I'm usually expecting. But when it comes to something like this, just the expectation for what I've had from wash processed Ethiopian coffees in the past is so high that anything that is, I want to say, not up to those standards is going to just feel like another washed Ethiopian coffee review. And that's a little bit of the case with this one, is the profile of these coffees aren't just necessarily in line with my own preferences. And I've kind of highlighted that mostly due to the fact that my own preferences are a fair bit lighter than a lot of the way these coffees have turned out. And in addition to that, I'm not really set up to brew coffees like this very well. I know that about myself, and it's not to say that profiles like this can't be overly impressive, but I just feel like it's very hard to get a washed Ethiopian coffee of this profile to be something that I will very much enjoy. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. By that same token, it is along the lines of the other experiences we had with this coffee roaster, which is to say it feels more traditional washed Ethiopian. So it does have a little bit more intensity to it. It does have a little bit more body to it, and it does offer a little bit more of those classic profiles with a slight bit more robustness to it in general. So you are experiencing a lot of those citric qualities to it. You are experiencing a lot of that sweetness as well, and it's a lot of what a lot of people would expect from a coffee like this around the time frame that I've continued to highlight that this coffee reminds me of. So that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Ayla Bombe wash processed Ethiopia from Bold Bean Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.